weeks now, looking at different aspects of what Proverbs says about our lives, what Proverbs says about being wise in different capacities of our lives, relationships, justice for the poor, wise in the way that we interact with one another, wise in the way we deal with our anger. We've been grouping these Proverbs by topics. Because the book of Proverbs, of course, you can't go through it linearly. It doesn't work that way. It's a collection of Proverbs on different subjects, and you have to kind of group them together topic by topic, and then see what they say to our lives and see what they say about wisdom. And primarily what we've seen is that wisdom, at least according to the Bible, at least according to the book of Proverbs, wisdom is not a code or a set of rules. Wisdom is not simply guidelines. The book of Proverbs is extremely easy to open it up and say, well, this is what Proverbs 26:4 says. This is what Proverbs 31:2 says, and so I'm going to apply that to my life right now. No. What we've seen is that the book of Proverbs doesn't necessarily give us the code to being wise, but it gives us more the character of how we are supposed to become wiser people by our nature. And overall, the book of Proverbs echoes one thing over and over and over and over again, and it says this: the wise person, more often than not, almost always, the wisest people in the world are the humblest people. If you look at this in Proverbs 26:12, it says, do you see a person wise in their own eyes? There's more hope for a fool than for them. They're saying, the people who think, if you think you're wise, you're probably on your way to foolishness. But on the other hand, if you think you're a fool, and if you're in touch with your weaknesses and your brokenness, and you know your limitations, you are either a wise person, or you're on your path towards being a wiser person. Proverbs speaks again and again about the necessity of humility in order to gain wisdom, to become a wise person. It begins with humility. Even in Proverbs 16, verse 9, it says, essentially, humility is worth more than even gold. It says it's better to be humble than to share in plunders. Humility is the bedrock, it says, of being a wise person. And so therefore, what I wanted to do today was look at what stops you and me from being humble people and then therefore wise people. And of course, the book of Proverbs has a title for what stops you and me from being humble people and therefore wise people, and it gives this word called pride, or another way you can say it is haughtiness. And it says, listen, if you want to know what's going to stop you and me from being humble, it's obviously pride. But in order to get it to the bottom of pride and uproot it out of our hearts and lives, we've got to stare into pride, understand what it is, and then understand what the gospel says about to uproot it. Here's a little exercise, though. You know I like being interactive, okay? So you should all have a big space, empty space on the bottom of your sermon outline. Do you have that? Or you could do this on your bulletin, I don't care. Any blank space. And I want you to, if you have a pen, hopefully you do, you can find a pen or scrounge a pen, and this is a chance for you to get to know your neighbor and ask, do you have a pen? Oh, by the way, what's your name? You're new here. You have a way to get to know each other here. Take a pen. And I just want you to write down 4 words, just 4, and I'll get back to them later. This all makes sense later on. And the 4 words are going to be on the next slide. If you can move the next slide. Joe, yes. I want you to write these 4 words down, okay? Just write them down, and I'll get back to them later. I want you to write down the words. And the words, in case you can't see them, they're pretty big. The words are, the verdict is in, period. And you can write it on your smartphone if that's going to help you, if you're don't want to do old school paper. But the paper will be a little more beneficial, I guarantee you, for what the exercise that we're going to do at the end. So write these 4 words down, okay? The verdict is in. Okay? Now hold on to that paper in your hand, keep it warm, and we'll get back to it in a little bit. First, though, I want to look at what pride is and why it's so destructive for us, and how we suffer underneath pride. And we get a few different takes on pride here in the Proverbs. First, if you look at chapter 11, verse 12, and by the way, all those Proverbs are inside your bulletin if you picked it up. So you can follow along inside your bulletin if you don't have your Bible or if you can't find the verse readily. Chapter 11, verse 12 says this: whoever belittles a neighbor lacks sense, but a man of understanding remains silent. Now, when it says belittles his neighbor lacks sense, it's talking about pride and saying something very interesting about pride. It's saying pride isn't necessarily having something, but pride is having something over and against someone else. See, it says when you have pride, what you do is you look at others and you start the comparison game. Pride, it isn't enough that you just have something, or that you're good looking, or that you're educated, or that you have money. It's always that you have more money than the next person, that you're better looking than the next person, that you're nicer than the next person, that you're more righteous than the next person. This is what pride does to us as human beings. It comes into our hearts and it says, it's not enough for you to feel good about yourself. You need to find someone else who's lower than you, and you need to compare yourself to them. This is one of the greatest evils of pride. And I put a quote in from C.S. Lewis in your bulletin. He wrote a great chapter on pride in Mere Christianity, and he says it this way. He says, there's one vice of which no man in the world is free, which everyone in the world loathes when he sees it in someone else, and of which hardly any people, except Christians, and I would say actually Christians more so, ever imagine that they are guilty themselves. He says, I've heard people admit that they are bad-tempered, or they cannot keep their heads about girls or drink, or even that they're cowards. But I do not think I have ever heard anyone who is not a Christian accuse himself of this vice. And at the same time, I have very seldom met anyone who is not a Christian who showed the slightest mercy to it in others. There is no fault which makes a man more unpopular, and no fault which we are more unconscious of in ourselves. And the more we have it in ourselves, the more we dislike it in others. The vice I'm talking about is pride or self-conceit. See, he says first, pause here. He says, listen, he says, I've talked to a lot of people, and nobody ever wants to admit this. They all can admit that maybe they lie every once in a while. They all can admit that maybe they have an anger problem, but nobody wants to admit that they're proud. But you know how you know? Because you hate it when you see it in other people. How dare they be that way? But he goes on and says, pleasure in being praised is not pride. The child who is patted on the back for doing a lesson well, the woman whose beauty is praised by her lover, the saved soul to whom Christ says, well done, are pleased and ought to be. For here the pleasure lies not in what you are, but in the fact that you please someone you wanted and rightly wanted to please. And here's where he says, echoes Proverbs chapter 11. He says, pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only out of having it more than the next man. We say that people are proud of being rich or clever or good looking, but they are not. They are proud of being richer or cleverer or better looking than others. If someone else became equally rich or clever or good looking, there would be nothing to be proud about. It is the comparison that makes you proud, the pleasure of being above the rest. See, he knows Proverbs 21:24 that says, the proud and the arrogant person, mocker is his name. See, it's not enough that you're proud and you and me are proud, but our pride manifests itself in the mocking. It manifests itself in looking around and finding everyone else who has less than we do and feeling, but that's what makes us feel so much better about ourselves. We know that we're good. We know that we're approved when we can look around and we can see that we have more of something than the other person. But pride doesn't just stop there. It gets so much more evil and insidious, and it creeps in our hearts. And you see what's going on? When you and I look around and we compare ourselves to other people, do you know what we're doing? We're building our resume. We're amassing the spiritual resume that we need for spiritual approval that we are so desperately seeking in our life. We're building our case. Arthur Miller was the playwright who, of course, wrote Death of a Salesman. He wrote another play that not many people liked that much. I mean, some people liked it, but it wasn't nearly as popular, and it's called After the Fall. And he captures what pride does here. He captures why it's so hard for you and me to get humility. And here's what he does. His main character, Quentin, the whole play is dealing with issues, post-Holocaust, dealing with issues of innocence and judgment, performance and obligation and duty and right versus wrong. And at the end of it, Quentin, most of the play is going on in his head, and he's thinking through it. It's a highly cerebral activity. And at the end, he comes to one conclusion. And this is what we do every day. And this is why pride is so dangerous. He says here, Quentin, he says, for many years, I looked at life like a case at law. It was a series of proofs. When you're young, you prove how brave you are, or smart. Then what a good lover. Then a good father. finally how wise or powerful or whatever it may be. But underlying it all, he said, I see now there was a presumption that one moved on an upward path towards some elevation where God knows that I would be justified or even condemned. A verdict, anyway. He says, I think now that my disaster really began when I looked up one day and the bench was empty. No judge in sight. And all that remained was the endless argument with oneself, this pointless litigation of existence before an empty bench. You see what Quentin's saying here? He says, when you and I have pride, what we're doing is we're arguing our case in court. And it's either going to be the court of public opinion, or it could even be the court of our own heart. But what pride is saying is, you're good, fight it in court, argue it. And Quentin at the end says, I looked up and I was fighting and I was building my resume and I was amassing this spiritual approval, this approval. And he says, I looked at the bench and it was empty. He says it was endless litigation to prove himself. And this is what pride makes you and me do. Endlessly litigate to prove ourselves to others. Endlessly argue our lives in the courtroom of public opinion to prove that we're good enough, to prove that we're okay. And if we can win that verdict, we'll feel okay. But Quentin knows something that you will get to at the end of our lives. He looks at the bench and he says, it's been empty. That's not where I needed to find my judgment. Pride is so destructive because it deceives us, it makes us a mocker, it deceives us into the endless litigation and the endless fighting for our case in the courtroom, but it ultimately leads to disaster. And these are very famous verses. Chapter 11, verse 2, when pride comes, then disgrace, with the humble is wisdom. And then the very famous one that you've probably all heard many, many times, chapter 16, verse 18, pride goes before destruction. The way that sentence is structured, by the way, I wish I could break it apart even more. It says, listen, it's not an if, maybe clause. It says, if you're a proud person, you will always, 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 always end up in destruction. It's like a parade. When pride comes, right before it, on the next float, is destruction. Now, why? Why? Why does destruction always follow pride? Well, there's one obvious answer, and there's one not so obvious answer. First, the obvious. Pride always comes before destruction because if you and me are too proud to take advice of the people in our lives, we're going to continue to make the same stupid, silly mistakes over and over and over again. But there's an even more interesting one here. If you look at chapter 13, verse 10, it says, where there is strife, there is pride, but wisdom is found in those who take advice. It says here, listen, when you're a proud person, you'll know it because you'll always be getting into quarrels. You'll always be, it says, where pride is, there's strife. And if you think about this logically, let me put it this way. If you walk in to my house and I'm hanging a picture on the wall, and you look at the picture and you say, you know, Pastor, that's a little off. It's like out of balance. Now, if I'm a proud person, you know what I'm going to say to you? Idiot. You know how hard I worked on this? What are you talking about? Get out of here. Why? Because I'm too proud to even see, it's not about the picture at that point, it's about me. It's about my courtroom case. You're talking about the picture. I'm pretty sure you are. You're not insulting my character or my skills at hanging pictures. You're just saying, hey, Pastor, I think that picture's a little off balance. But see, it stops becoming about the picture. And it becomes about me. Let me give you another example. And I'll make sense. Let me give you another illustration. If I went home from work and my wife comes to me and says, honey, how was your day? I've never said to her ever, when she's asked that question, I've never said, my day was fantastic because my toes worked so well today. Okay, see? Wouldn't that be quite silly? If I said, listen, my toes, they worked perfectly today. My day was great. They kept balance and they worked, all 10 of them worked in unison and they felt comfortable the whole day. No, I don't talk about my toes unless something's wrong with them. And you see, this is what pride does. Pride goes into the ego and says, cry out for the attention that you need, because fundamentally our egos are broken, bruised, cut. You never talk about your toes or your fingers unless something's wrong with them. Why then do you and I constantly bring ourselves into the courtroom? Why do we take our ego and have it get slit and cut and hurt so many times throughout the days, throughout the weeks? Everyone snubs us, everyone wrongs us, and it cuts to our core. Why? Because it's pride. And it's the ego saying, I'm hurt. Look at me. I'm cut. Fix me. Pride is destructive. It's deceptive. It's within all of us. Now, what's the cure? To cure pride, we're going to do something this morning that may insult some of you in this room, because the book of Proverbs gives almost a very insulting answer as to how you and I can cure pride and therefore become wise. And here's what it says. If you look at Proverbs 3:34, he says, he, meaning God, Yahweh, mocks proud mockers, but here, he shows favor. The better way to translate that word is grace. He shows grace to the humble and the oppressed. Again, in verse 35, later on, he says, the wise inherit honor, but only fools get shame. And he says, before the downfall in 1812 of the heart is haughty, but humility comes before honor. Here, this word honor means a gift. And what Proverbs is saying is, you and I need a gift. You and I require a gift. But this gift, because of our proud nature, we're not going to want to accept. And the gift is grace. Let me put it this way. If you come up to me, and my birthday's in a few weeks, by the way. If you come up to me and you say, hey, Pastor, here's a birthday gift. That's not a joke. It really is in a few weeks. Some of you are laughing about that. I'm putting a plug, so now you know. If you come, and don't give me this gift, but if you came up and gave me a gift and I opened it up and it was a bar of soap, I would say thank you. You obviously must mean that I have body odor that I must take care of. Now listen, please don't give me a bar of soap. That would be insulting. But some gifts are insulting, yet some gifts are completely necessarily insulting. And that is grace. What Proverbs tells us is, listen, only the humble get the honor. It's a gift. You don't earn it, and it may be very insulting to you. And if the gift of grace, if knowing that you need a gift to fix your bruised ego this morning, if hearing that and saying, I don't want that, that sounds preposterous, well then, you're at the point where you're too proud to accept this gift. Grace, by its very definition, is insulting. It insults our sensibilities. We feel deep down, again, we're in the courtroom. We want to earn it. It's our case. We can defend ourselves. We can prove ourselves. How dare you say that I need a gift of grace? And yet, this is what Proverbs says. It says, only honor comes to the humble. It says, God gives it. You don't earn it. And if you want this honor, if you want this grace, it comes through humility. Because if you go back to the beginning of the Bible, this is the way God always works. He always works through the humble. He chooses the weaker, he chooses the younger. He chooses Moses over Aaron. He chooses Sarah over Hagar. He chooses Tamar through all of the mess of her life. He chooses Rahab the prostitute. He chooses Hannah the barren woman. God consistently chooses the ugly person, the ugly woman that nobody wanted, or the stuttering boy that nobody would listen to. Do you not see that this is the very pattern of the way God has worked since creation? To say, listen, if you want to fix that bruised, hurt ego that cries out in the courtroom for attention, amassing your resume until the bench is empty, if you want to fix it, it comes through knowing exactly how broken, how flawed, how weak you are, and yet how God will work through that and only that. He does this even in sending Jesus to the cross. And in Jesus on the cross, we see the ultimate act of humility and foolishness and stupidity that the world would ever know, and yet it was the very way in which God worked through you and me to give that grace, to give us that gift. Let me put it this way. Most of you like making 5-year plans. Say you were to wake up tomorrow and say, I want to, 2,000 years from now, be known all around the world. 2,000 years from now, I would love people to read my words, 2,000 years from now, I would love for people to center their lives on me, to change. I would love for people to pray for me 2,000 years. And I would say, 2,000 years from now, and I would look at you and say, that's a very noble goal. How do you plan on doing it? And if you looked at me and said, well, when I'm about 33, at the peak of my career and the peak of my life, I want to go and die on a cross and have everybody leave me. You see the foolishness in that. Yet, Paul says in 1 Corinthians, that's wisdom. It's finding how exactly broken and how exactly flawed you and I are. It's finding humility. It's knowing that in humility, it's going down to get up. It's losing strength to get strength. It's serving others to be served. It's not in pride, and it's not in the ego that calls out into the courtroom saying, look how good I am. I know I'm good. But rather it's saying, look what Jesus did for me. He went to the cross in complete humility. And he died. That's grace. But now, let me close by saying this. I know it's all good to hear this on a Sunday morning, and trust me, I used to work a real job, and I know what it takes. Tomorrow, you're going back into that courtroom. Tomorrow, you're going to go back into school. Tomorrow, you're going to go back into your office. Tomorrow, you're going to go back into your home and your relationships, your work, your jobs, your friendships, whatever it is. And you're going to look at me and say, Pastor, that was great on Sunday, but now it's Monday, and I'm being sucked back into the courtroom. What do you do? The answer comes in that last proverb that we read, and we said it at the very beginning 12 weeks ago when we started this series. It's the very famous line in chapter 1, verse 7, that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, or you can say wisdom too. Here's what you got to do to get out of the courtroom. You have to find something that you fear in awe and wonder and complete amazement, more so than the court. You've got to find it. If you don't find fear and awe and wonder and amazement by staring at what God did for you through Jesus on the cross, if you don't have awe and wonder at that, you're forever going to be trapped in the courtroom, spinning, presenting, performing. There was one guy who got it, at least. Many people, but one guy who got it that was very famous, in Paul. In 1 Corinthians, remember, he writes to them, and he's writing to this church, and he knows this. He knows something about this Arthur Miller thing thousands of years before he writes it. And he says in 1 Corinthians 4:3, I care very little if I'm judged by you or by any human court. And some of you say, that's good. Paul had good self-esteem. That's good. He had high self-esteem. Pause. He says, I don't care if I'm judged by you. Indeed, I do not even judge myself. My conscience is clear. But that does not make me innocent. It is the Lord who judges me. See, Paul gets the gospel. He gets how broken he was, how flawed he was, how utterly despicable he was, and how he was in the courtroom. Remember, he says it here. I don't care about the judge of the court. I was in the courtroom before, but now I'm free. And in Galatians, he says, this is exactly why Christ died for us, for our freedom. Why then do we spend our endless days in the courtroom of public opinion, spinning ourselves and presenting ourselves and trying to mask and cover up everything that's broken in us and everything that's dirty and despicable and flawed? He says, do it no more. Paul says, I am no more in that courtroom. He says, I found that Jesus says, I am free. And you know, it was Jesus who went into the courtroom, and he didn't stand a chance. He was beaten. The court went down on him. People stared at him. People mocked him. He had no case in that courtroom. And you know why he did it? So that you and I can get out of that courtroom once and for all. I want you to do something on that piece of paper that you wrote. After those 4 words, I want you to write 4 more words. And then what I want you to do is rip that piece of paper and fold it and keep it. I want you to keep this week. And I want you to look at this whenever you start to be back in the courtroom. Whenever you start to grumble, to gripe, to mock, to look at others and say, I'm better than them, I know I am. When you start to do that, fold out this piece of paper, read these words, the verdict is in, and the last 4 words, and I am free. Court is over. The verdict is in. Jesus got the verdict of death. I get the verdict of life, and I am free. No more courtrooms, no more resumes, no more building our images. Because in the eyes of God, through what Jesus did for us, we are radiant, we are beautiful, and we are free. The verdict is in, and you are free. Take some time in silent prayer now to meditate on this. If this has not been a reality for you, if you did not know this before, know it today. This is your chance. Don't wait. Know that the Lord of the universe ran to you on the cross. He gave his life, and the verdict came down on him so that it will never come down on you. You need not fear. You are free. Pray on that.